Listening to Gang of Four's entertainment is like relentlessly dancing, leaping, hula hooping, and sarcastically saluting voters outside your local polling place for this year's city council election. All of which is, of course, a manifestation of your panic, knowing that this democratic facade will do nothing to deter the bureaucratic corruption that has poisoned every facet of life in your hometown for decades. This is one of the most comprehensively defiant records in rock and punk history. It established a shrewdly righteous, awkwardly danceable clamor that remains ceaselessly imitated but very rarely equaled. Listening to Parquet Court's Wide Awake is like accepting a juggling quartet's invitation to watch them crash the first rally that Donald Trump had the audacity to hold after losing so disgracefully to Joe Biden in 2020. After stopping at a coffee house to imbibe 5 shots of espresso each, said quartet arrives to the rally in sad clown makeup and face masks bearing drawings of pouty lips. Then spends the next 40 minutes tossing clubs to each other in a tightly coordinated routine that somehow works as a highly accurate parody of Trump's conspiratory whining. This is the best record yet released by this Brooklyn-based group. Danger Mouse helped them expand the possibilities of their punk-infused alternative rock without sacrificing any of the wit and vigor that endeared them to so many in the first place. Listening to Minutemen's double nickels on the dime is like reading a viciously funny collection of single-panel comic strips about a White House intern who quickly discovers that the only things U.S. Congress members do at work is dance around their offices while mockingly reciting the various pleas for change they receive in the mail. This is an intelligent, impassioned 45-track record by 3 prodigiously talented musicians, taking the spirit and aesthetics of punk wherever they damn well pleased, resulting in one of the Reagan era's definitive rock documents. Listening to Swans' The Great Annihilator is like watching a black and white film noir, depicting a man and woman who are total strangers to each other, both walking toward an oncoming thunderstorm on an especially humid day. Not necessarily because they enjoy the thought of being rained on and potentially struck by lightning, but because it just seems like a better option than associating themselves with all the idiots running away from the impending, inevitable doom and gloom. This is a formidably layered and surprisingly catchy record, a mid-career adaptation of every strength exhibited up to that point by one of the most stylistically restless groups in rock and punk history. Listening to the Fall's Hex Induction Hour is like scowling at the supervisor who dares interrupt your antisocial routine by politely asking you to please stop blasting that weird song on loop, get off your in-office treadmill, and take inventory like he asked you to an hour ago. So you huff over to your desk, press pause on your phone, repeatedly write the word inventory in purposefully illegible cursive until it fills both sides of a single page. Press play, hand said page to your boss with an exaggerated grin, and get back on your treadmill knowing that this bullshit's just another Tuesday for you. This is the most relatively danceable record in this punk-adjacent rock group's extensive, challenging discography. 2 drummers. Listening to Cardiac's The Seaside is like helping an oddly dressed, intellectually brilliant, and behaviorally disruptive boy discover that he can effectively quell his frequent panic attacks by using finger paint to transcribe rhythms that change time signatures with every new measure. This initially cassette-only release is an amalgam of rock's flashiest indulgences with a distinctly punk delivery, resulting in a delightfully deranged aesthetic that was tragically misunderstood by most listeners at the time of its autonomous release, but has since developed a sizable cult following. Listening to Devo's question, "Are we not men?" answer, "We are Devo," is like reading a graphic novel about a sleep and medication-deprived child who is literally unable to stop jumping, laughing, and shouting whenever he suspects his fellow fifth graders of being afraid. To embrace and flaunt their own idiosyncrasies. This is one of rock history's most neurotic, sardonic, and original records. It reimagined punk as a safe space for misfits that were too weird and too nerdy to ever be considered fashionable. Listening to Pixies' Surfer Rosa is like throwing a massive outdoor party for 4 children who all turned 12 the same week, mischievously grinning at the sight of them laughing at your potty-mouthed birthday card. Then eating all the coffee beans in the bags that you gifted each of them. And finally running and screaming until their legs and vocal cords just give out. This is a crucial touchstone in the development of alternative rock. Not to mention the most disquieting and abrasive record in this Bostonian group's discography. P.S. I'm pet sitting right now, hence the kitties. Patreon.com/Todd's Top 10s. Thank you so much for all the support. Listening to Elvis Costello's This Year's Model is like being a 9th grader with ADHD and ODD, who, after being asked for the umpteenth time to stop doodling on your chorus teacher's dry erase board and go back to your assigned seat, throws an utterly legendary tantrum that involves belting your section's parts at an overpowering larynx-damaging volume, all while using a permanent marker to write "Best Teacher Ever" in all caps next to a drawing of said teacher hanging from a noose. This remains the most relentlessly rocking album ever made by this notoriously scornful artist. His irrepressible pop instincts gained an even sharper bite, thanks to a then uncredited backing band called The Attractions. Listening to Coldplay's A Rush of Blood to the Head is like watching your hostile mate eat an entire box of the world's darkest chocolates, then put on headphones and hug a pillow, while faintly humming to himself for nearly an hour. During a seeming pause in between tracks in his playlist, you ask him why he seems so sullen, and he initially fails to respond at all. Before you leave the room, he finally, flatly explains how he came to this city in hopes of finding his soulmate, only for those hopes to be unquestionably fulfilled and just as surely dashed by circumstance, leaving him with nothing but memories of all her favorite songs. This is the moment when this unabashedly sincere and sensitive pop quartet started pounding on the door to rock stardom. Listening to David Bowie's Hunky Dory is like accompanying a decidedly alternative fashionista on his visit to the massive underbrush of ferns where he used to play as a child, gladly succumbing to his infectious joy as you two eat copious amounts of pickled eggs, then try to topple each other over while hopping on one foot, and finally warble your own kooky adaptations of every classic song that you can remember. This is an adroitly composed, resolutely glamorous modernization of various pop cliches. It irreversibly redesigned rock music as a place where antiquated cultural and sexual boundaries no longer existed nor mattered. Listening to Arcade Fire's Funeral is like quietly humming your recently deceased grandparents' favorite songs to yourself in October while walking through a park littered with equally deceased leaves, respectfully waiting until you are completely alone to belt those same songs at the top of your lungs in a semi-successful attempt to exorcise your own profound grief. This record shattered mid-2000s trends toward detached cynicism with a purgative, invigorating blend of indie pop orchestration and alternative rock urgency, depicting the unwieldiest feelings of life or death angst on a shamelessly necessarily huge canvas. Listening to Public Image Limited's Metal Box, aka Second Edition, is like being locked inside a windowless room during a power outage, playing captive audience to a man desperately trying to silence a deluge of intrusive thoughts by chanting "This too shall pass" over and over again, while bouncing a ball against a wall with metronomic consistency. This is the most uncompromising and rewarding record created thus far by John Lydon's post-Sex Pistols rock quartet. They adapted punk's caustic neuroses into austerely EQ'd grooves that casually plowed right through the genre's constraints. Listening to Glenn Branca's The Ascension is like filming an avant-garde thriller in which you are cast as one of 4 electric guitarists, forced to play exclusively sour, constantly crescendoing harmonies in an attempt to silence an audience, teeming with extremely strange haircuts and a unanimous resolve to drown you out with incessant, invasive chatter. This is a pioneering instrumental stunner. It repurposed experimental rock and post-punk as a distinctly post-minimalist vehicle for exploring the sheer euphoria of gradually shifting timbres and textures. Listening to This Heat's Deceit is like suffering an extended nervous breakdown after hearing the umpteenth politician declare yet another war in a dying world where exclusively demolished cities and a perpetually obscured sun are simply dismissed as collateral damage. This is a truly unpredictable and uncompromising record, recorded in an abandoned meat locker, where this underrated English band apparently mutilated the sounds of punk-adjacent rock beyond recognition, then organized the remains into a topical art installation, guaranteed to unsettle anyone who encounters it in any era. No one could ever be truly ready for this record until after a nuclear holocaust, when music like this will probably be all that humanity still deserves to hear. Listening to Slint's Spiderland is like sitting alone outside after a late night band practice, waiting for your ride home in the middle of light rainfall. As you peer up at the charcoal black clouds from your barely sufficient bus stop shelter, you feel your blood pressure slowly increase in response to fear that no one attending your gig tomorrow night will be able to follow or appreciate the meter changes that you and your bandmates have been painstakingly rehearsing all month. This is an unprecedented, initially ignored slow burner that eventually became and still remains the golden standard for any group infusing hardcore's raw power with restraint, subtlety, and grace. Listening to Toe's The Book About My Idle Plot on a Vague Anxiety is like being an interpretive dancer, commissioned to practice 3 times a week with 2 guitarists, a bassist, and a drummer, who inspire you with their willingness to carefully, patiently master the 11 odd metered melodies they most recently composed. This is a convincing argument for tight, technical rock instrumentals as ideal facilitators for open-ended contemplation. Listening to Talking Heads' Remain in Light is like babysitting a hyperactive young boy who starts having a panic attack after news breaks out about a new COVID-19 strain. You then try to alleviate his anxiety by encouraging him to dance and jump along to his favorite songs while covering the entire living room with washable arts and crafts paint. This is the wordy, polyrhythmic pinnacle of this New York-based quartet's first 4 years of recorded existence. During that time, they not only pushed rock and punk to all kinds of fresh, unabashedly awkward places, but they also established a permanent residence in the hearts of at least 2 perpetually confused generations. Listening to Have a Nice Life's Deathconsciousness is like standing at the edge of a very tall cliff with a mask to hide your hideous face and an umbrella to protect your freshly highlighted hair from the rain, staring up at the beautifully gray clouds, and knowing that the angels you're about to befriend will relieve the sadness and apathy more extensively than a lifetime of medication and therapy ever could. Don't do it. Listen to this album instead. This is a self-released, astoundingly dejected haze of noisy alternative rock and icy punk. It appeared out of nowhere to ultimately become a cathartic classic among online forum users. Listening to the Velvet Underground and Nico's one and only album together is like visiting a dingy building that doubles as a BDSM club and smack house on the most perpetually traffic-ridden street in New York City. Whenever you're not injecting heroin into your veins with a needle that looks like it's never been cleaned, you engage in degrading, unprotected sex with anyone who drowsily nods, "Yes, master." This is an incalculably influential groundbreaker. It slowly but surely established a thrillingly unsafe space for rock's weirdest and darkest extremes. Listening to Swans' To Be Kind is like being the protagonist in a vividly animated 2-hour film that documents you becoming fed up with a world constantly telling you to lower your stentorian voice, and so deciding to end said world by climbing atop Mount Everest and loudly screaming, "Shut the fuck up!" over and over and over again until the Earth's geodynamo is dispelled, leaving the sun's charged particles to completely incinerate this lame-ass planet. This is one of the most fully, impressively realized records of the past 10 years. It found Michael Gira and company introducing relative humor and accessibility to their famously uncompromising rock. Listening to the Velvet Underground's White Light, White Heat is like playing the most poorly recorded, mixed, and mastered record in your collection on a barely operational stereo system cranked up to 11. The ideal soundtrack for a party at which you and some fellow junkie prostitutes take turns, smoking methamphetamine, coughing and or vomiting blood, popping genital warts, and spreading such warts to each other via the kind of sex that does not discriminate against orifices. This is the least approachable offering in this New York-based rock band's legendary discography. It caught the greasiest, most lawless lightning conceivable in a post-Andy Warhol pre-Doug Yule bottle shaped a hell of a lot like punk. Listening to Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band's Trout Mask Replica is like reading a perversely hilarious comic strip about an anthropomorphic, insomniac, air-breathing fish who insists that he's composed the greatest thing to ever happen in the history of sound, then spends 8 months teaching 5 other land-dwelling sea creatures how to play 28 pieces transcribed as nearly illegible crayon swirls, with dirty jokes for lyrics and no time signatures that last for longer than 1 measure. This is nearly 80 minutes of barely controlled chaos. It has inspired countless musicians to explore the more WTF end of rock for the past half-century or so, yet remains unparalleled in its offbeat intricacy. Listening to Patti Smith's Horses is like witnessing a poetry student respond to the teacher's demands for a more refined second draft by jumping on top of her desk and reciting her messy, rough draft with immense vigor, spontaneity, and pride. This is an earth-shattering record. It combined the brawn of a rock band, the brains of a singer-songwriter, and a thrillingly defiant attitude that would soon be described as punk. Listening to David Bowie's Heroes is like viewing a series of abstract self-portraits painted by a friend with generalized anxiety disorder, which he apparently worked through by depicting himself traveling at least 100 years forward in time without his Prozac, then transforming his own body into a shape-shifting hovercraft, and then flying far above the clouds and orbiting the entire Earth despite his monumental fear of heights. This is the nerviest and most meticulous record to emerge from this iconic English artist's late 1970s Berlin era. At that time, Bowie and Brian Eno simultaneously paid homage to rock's then greatest innovators and provided a fearlessly modernist template for countless trajectories. Listening to Black Midi's Schlagenheim is like being a probation officer, checking in on two mischievous teenage boys who evidently have no problem blending into and occasionally surpassing the perpetual din of their busy neighborhood, plugging their electric guitars into a dizzying network of effects pedals, cranking their amplifiers well past the clipping threshold, and using rainbow-colored slinkies to play the aforementioned instrument's strings. In theory, this is a surefire recipe for amateurish cacophony. In practice, these troublemakers' unusual MO actually results in an unpredictable yet impressively coordinated series of exclusively odd metered rhythms. How is this only their first album? Listening to the pop group's Why is like enduring a 40-minute solar eclipse that triggers a manic episode, during which time you stitch all of your Circle A patches into a full body suit and vigorously hula hoop while shouting, "We shall be free!" directly at the obscured sky. This is a truly radical, thrillingly antagonistic record. It not only dances on the ashes of anything resembling rock tradition, but it frankly makes most other late 1970s punk sound downright conservative by comparison. Listening to Black Country New Roads for the first time is like watching a thriller starring a very tired and distressed-looking man venturing through a windowless attic with a nearly dead flashlight, just when you think he's about to discover who or what has been making all those alarming noises for the past 7 minutes. He suddenly illuminates his face with the flashlight and decimates the fourth wall with a long, rapid-fire, sexually embittered monologue, implying that he is the only monster worth fearing in this film. This is the greatest debut album of the 2020s thus far. This London-based septet twists decades worth of rock and punk signifiers into truly unusual and exciting shapes. Listening to Hum's Inlet is like passing away from issues related to your morbid obesity, then being promptly visited by 10 angels who painstakingly carry you up to heaven, though you are externally very thankful to spend eternity hovering among the most beautiful clouds and stars that anyone could ever witness. You internally lament the fact that you not only still weigh about 600 pounds, but are also closely surrounded on all sides by corpulent people who died from complications painfully similar to yours. This is the first record in a near quarter century by these Illinois-based alternative rockers. It boasts the most metallic riffs and dynamics of their newly reinstated career. Listening to Swirlies, they spent their wild youthful days in the glittering world of the salons is like furiously typing and telemarketing just a few desks away from two co-workers of opposite genders who secretly dropped acid on their lunch break and are evidently spending the rest of their shifts slathering their desks with neon paint and singing along with the constant din of their busy office as if it were just the set list at a particularly electrifying concert. This is 1 hour of gauzy cacophony by a Bostonian collective who have yet to receive the credit they deserve for their complex, creatively chaotic approach to alternative rock sonics. Listening to Palanoweos to see the next part of the dream is like patiently, respectfully enduring an uncomfortably noisy dinner with a family in which you are obviously the black sheep, staring at your reflection in the mirror on the dining room wall across from you and seeing nothing but a poorly drawn, mouthless stick figure, awkwardly situated among photogenic humans with unbearably radiant smiles. This is a gorgeous grassroots masterpiece by the latest addition to a relatively long line of reclusive, self-deprecating, and accomplished hobbyists. It draws ample inspiration from the previous generation of punk-influenced alternative rock, yet is an unmistakable product of the Bandcamp era. Listening to The Cure's The Head on the Door is like meeting with your best frenemy in a garden teeming with pokeweed, sight-singing 10 melodies that he recently transcribed with a red-orange colored pencil. Though these tunes are meticulously crafted and undeniably beautiful, you get the distinct feeling that the reliably moody man who composed them will feel dissatisfied with your feedback, no matter how positive or negative it is. This is the shrewdly polished moment when a dreary, punk-adjacent cult favorite completely and rightfully transitioned into bona fide but still quite dreary rock stars. Listening to Godspeed You Black Emperors lift your skinny fists like antennas to heaven is like watching a 3D animated film about 9 quiet musicians transported to a massive, low-altitude space station before all of the Earth's tectonic plates shift at once. Though they are thankful to have been included among humanity's celestial refugees, as well as their discovery that the space station includes a sizable musical instrument store, all 9 of these instrumentalists stare wistfully out the window at the crumbling buildings far below, while patiently, carefully rendering elegies for those who were left behind. This record takes as much time as it needs to fully, logically, and poignantly explore every feeling that could qualify as rock. Listening to Lift to Experiences, the Texas Jerusalem Crossroads, is like watching a 3D computer-animated adventure film about a particularly devastating eschaton in Denton, of all places. Prophesied by a male protagonist so intensely charismatic that you immediately stand beneath the cross on your wall and begin praying for your own salvation once the movie ends. This is one of the most bizarrely poignant records in alternative rock history, delivering its unabashedly Christian and potentially embarrassing narrative with an ideal, effective balance of drama and discipline. Listening to Boris's Boris at Last feedbacker is like trying to escape the commotion of your perpetually busy office job and the reality of your own morbid obesity by gradually boosting the volume of your favorite 45-minute motivational hypnotherapy recording. But because the outfit you hastily chose for the day happens to be a little too small, the crescendoing gossip of your nearby coworkers dashes any hopes you had to fall under said recording's healing spell, compelling you to repeatedly scream, "I'm a work in progress and a masterpiece!" until the phrase leaves your mouth as speech bubbles, with edges jagged enough to poke holes in the office's roof and the Earth's ozone. You then literally crush and devour every one of these scoffers and mockers, so you may resume listening in quiet ultraviolet bliss. Listening to Godspeed You Black Emperor's God's Pee at State's End is like creating an hour-long playlist of the most powerful instrumental music in your collection, which you listen to on loop as a personal soundtrack for today's dangerous yet thrilling adventure through a world ravaged by hostile robots, zombified humans, close, and a pitch black fog engulfing its entire surface. None of which scare you as much as the fact that without this playlist as your impetus, your will to find and rescue the few non-infected humans left alive could easily turn far blacker than said fog. This is the sound of rock's greatest instrumental group, re-energized and ready for battle, during a time when so many of their predictions seem to be coming true.